ancient Greeks believed that in the beginning, on Earth, there were only men who lived with each other in peaceful harmony. After Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to men, Zeus was so furious that he punished everyone. He created a gift, a creature, beautiful, delightful, and irresistible, but also sneaky, curious, and devious. The first woman, Pandora. Men couldn't resist her beauty, and now among them, she couldn't resist a peek into a jar from Zeus that was to be kept shut. By opening it, Pandora released evil into the world, bringing to it sin and women and the end of men's paradise. That beauty like Pandora's can hide evil has remained true. Beautiful women in ancient Greece were acquitted of murder in trials where jurors saw their exposed bodies, and today, they still get handed lesser charges and lower sentences. Today, those considered beautiful have their work judged as superior, get treated better as patients, are more likely to get hired and promoted, and are considered more honest, warm, kind, sincere, and perceptive. The only issue is that Pandora, in the West today, would unlikely benefit from any of these. The ancient Greek beauty ideal that Zeus would have sent to men had a soft, untoned body with visible fat, a small chest, and a unibrow. The benefits of being beautiful haven't changed, we just change who we direct them to. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking Pandora's box is a normal story, but it is not. It is actually a theodicy, a way to try and explain why there is evil and apparently women in the world. The difference is, unlike a story, the characters don't have volition. Because we know the world has evil, we know how the myth must end. Their fates were always sealed. That Pandora was created to be maximally curious and given a closed box, her curiosity was not a challenge to be overcome, it was an elaborate poetic punishment. Wired to be curious and tempted from the start, it is not a question of if she will fail, it's when she will fail. And we enter the world like Pandora, with the beauty standards already set and due to change outside of our control, wired to crave the benefits of following them, while also wired to crave the tasty foods, the engaging rest, the surgeries and body modifications that temptingly whisper in our ear every day how our lives might be if we just better fit that standard. In a world where even Greek goddesses would be mid, it's again not a question of if we will hate our bodies, but when. Hesiod, who wrote Pandora's story, said that now that women were here, men were punished either way. To love them meant trouble and destruction, and to avoid them and not marry, they would do no better. In our attempt to reach the beauty standard in a world where it's hard to even be healthy, we face pretty much the same. To follow it requires precious money, time, resources, self-control, luck, risks being considered anti-feminist, risks eating disorders, body dysmorphia, lack of self-esteem, self-isolation, plastic surgery complications, even your actual life. To not follow it often involves all of the above too. But what is it? Where does the beauty standard come from and why? Western beauty standards may seem so natural and intuitive to me, but that's only because I've been subjected to them my whole life. We all know that even a small change in geography or time is enough for that logic to completely disappear. My granddad said that he cancelled his first arranged marriage because the proposed bride was blonde with blue eyes, which today would generally be considered beautiful in his country. The only thing stopping us from exploring our own intuitive beauty standards with the same curiosity we have towards a unibrow, elongated skull, or stretched lip is the price we'd have to pay for not adhering to them. I am obsessed with this topic, and so I've spent months reading hundreds of scientific papers, multiple books, to try and grasp how we got to be the self-critical, weight-obsessed, surgery-normalizing people we are today. And I have a huge issue with considering body standards and image a superficial problem. And it doesn't just come from the fact that I've seen and experienced firsthand the effects of these disorders in hospital, both as a soon-to-be doctor and a patient, but because beauty has never been just about beauty. Consistently, throughout the centuries, beauty standards switched as a result of economic and political changes. Wars, revolutions, inventions, disease, mobilizing those scrambling to gain or hold on to that political and economic power. The changes to beauty standards were determined and spread by churches, governments, businesses, and those excluding themselves from lower social classes. The beauty standards were enacted on women through consequences, such as higher or lower social status, higher or lower income, freedom or incarceration, trustworthiness or exclusion, health or illness, being hurt or oppressed, and even life or death. I'm going to go through that history of exactly what determined women's body standards in the West, starting from the Middle Ages and ending with the present day. There's obvious things like famine and vaccines, but also less obvious things like tuberculosis, cannibalism, and the Bible. For the present day in particular, I'll talk about obesity, all the misconceptions I still held in medicine, shocking things I was not taught, and why it's impossible to be beautiful today. The ancient Greeks thought that you couldn't change your beauty. The gods picked their favourites and poured beauty on them like perfume. We accept that God may have favourites, but that almost everyone can do with some surgical tweaking and more self-control. When I was younger, one of my most frequent daydreams was that everyone would become blind. Then my thoughts about beauty standards might go away and I could just live my life. Neither of those happened, but maybe somehow by understanding where all of this pain comes from, I can provide you also with a different type of relief. Before we get into the meat of the video, I do want to point out that it's going to be a heavy one. Studies estimate that up to 80% of us are unhappy with how we look. So therefore, chances are, if you're watching this, you've also been negatively affected by the internalized pressures of how we should present ourselves in the world and what consequences our looks might have on our life. If you've ever thought you'd benefit from speaking to someone about your thoughts and feelings, having a safe space to analyze, question, and rebuild the ways we see ourselves and the world, therapy is a great place to do that. And BetterHelp, who is a paid partner of this video, are a great option I would recommend. It was actually my BetterHelp therapist who taught me a lot of the frameworks that I currently use to cope with anxiety, and they have been essential to get me through the very, very rough last few months of medical school. Even living in London, where I have lots of options for therapy, finding the time to travel back and forth from an office, as much as I love in-person therapy, is not something I would be able to keep up with weekly, which is why I am so grateful for online therapy. With BetterHelp, you are connected usually within 48 hours with a credentialed professional who can help guide you on the path of processing your thoughts and emotions in a healthier way. I've had an incredible experience using them for months myself, and definitely recommend it to anyone who is considering therapy and has ever felt that lack of time or finding a therapist in the first place would be difficult. If you are struggling with anything, I would really encourage you to try BetterHelp like I did. Sometimes it just takes a person to point a thing out for your whole perspective on life to change. If you use betterhelp.com/Elizabeth Phillips or the code Elizabeth Phillips during sign up, you'll get a special discount on your first month. I hope it goes amazingly if you get started. In the 14th century poem, Dante's Inferno, he travels to the third circle of hell, a place filled with cold, unending rain and hail, where souls are being punished by lying face first in the icy mud, left blind, starving, and unfulfilled, their bodies being torn apart for eternity by the three-headed dog Cerberus. The sin that brought them there? Gluttony. If you also think that it's a bit extreme to see overeating as worthy of punishment with eternal hunger and excruciating pain, it makes even less sense if we consider what people's lives were like at the time. Europe at the end of the 13th century had reached such a population size, such that famines were unavoidable and widespread, with reports stating that they occurred at least once every 5 years. Add to that disease, war, tough labour and toil, you'd be more likely to die of starvation than eat enough to be judged by the church. While Pope Gregory detailed 5 different types of overeating and gluttony, and St. Paul described overeaters as enemies of the cross, whose god is their belly, can you really judge a starving person for wanting to eat sooner, too eagerly, too wildly, or too much, all of which were considered sinful? For the church, to be slim was to be pious. What makes this weirder is that we didn't always respond to famine with a desire for a slim body. Just 11,000 years ago, when people were also struggling with finding food, they carved female figures representing their ideals of beauty. Starting with the Venus of Willendorf, we've uncovered 97 Paleolithic statues of women's bodies, 51 of which were overweight or obese, ratios which definitely did not represent the population of the time. So, what happened in Europe's churches? Marvin Harris explains the church's focus on diet as an egalitarian response to recurring food shortages. In the newer agricultural and non-tribal society, inequalities between the rich and the poor meant that while the rich could enjoy their indulgent feasts, sometimes a fourth of the population would die in a bout of famine. If the church could frame excessive enjoyment of food as cruel, maybe less people would die of starvation. Did it work? Well, in the words of Bertrand Russell, the rich for thousands of years have preached the dignities of labour and virtue while choosing themselves to remain undignified in this regard. Foreshadowing for how this will change later. While famines were ravaging the continent every few years, paintings of the rulers, noblemen and women showed them to be looking quite healthy, if not by their own standards, sinful. This obvious physical disparity between the thinness of the poor and the heavier figures of the rich meant that despite the moral push of the church, with increasing famines, obesity remained and became further established as a visible sign of wealth and personal success. By seeing also the representations of the ideal female form in paintings of the time, great examples of which are Rubens's work, it's been estimated that the female beauty ideal of the agricultural era had a BMI of between 27 and 30, a figure which we today would consider overweight. Knowing that royal marriages at the time were political, I spent ages trying to find paintings of the mistresses of European kings, which were more likely a result of sexual selection and therefore sexual preference, and they also consistently showed bodies that were heavier than the average of the time. The clothes of this era emphasized a woman's larger bust and hips with a relatively smaller waist, with dresses having bodices aiming to achieve an upside-down triangle shape and very, very large skirts being in fashion. Despite its unattainability for the average person, despite the church's condemnation of excess, for the medieval people, a heavier female was a beautiful female. There was more than sensuous pleasure associated with the fullness of a body. It was a visual expression of stability and order. Being so used to hearing about the medical issues related to obesity, it might be hard for us to immediately appreciate how not being overweight might have negative consequences for someone. But the female body has never been just a body. When speaking and thinking in English, we are limited by the language to appreciate just how important aligning with a beauty standard can be. As Daniel McNeill explains in his book, The Face, because in English, beauty generally refers to one's physical appearance, we can easily overlook the connection between beauty and goodness, which is much more obvious in other languages. Socrates struggled to define the Greek word kalos, meaning both pretty and good. German has schön, Spanish bonita, Zulu le, Hungarian zep, Swahili zuri, Amharic maklam, and many, many others. That beauty and morality and goodness are also connected means that the consequences of not being seen as beautiful in your group can reach far beyond sexual attraction. I'll refer to lots of these later. This connection with morality is also seen in how obesity is portrayed in literature, with the characters that are overweight in Don Quixote and Hamlet being seen as cute, likable, nice, in sharp contrast to their skinny counterparts in the books being miserly, agonizing, and introverted. An easier example would also be Santa Claus versus Scrooge. Ecnian and Shepherd go further to suggest that being overweight was in itself considered feminine, both physically and morally. Since antiquity, strength rather than fat has been admired in the male body, a good example being Sparta, where you had to pass a test of physical fitness when you were born or you'd be chucked away. Then again, have a fitness test at the age of 18 in order to maintain the Spartan citizenship. And only men thereout had to remain in this physical shape until the age of 60. Any who became fat were banished from Sparta, which is why Socrates had to dance around his home to remain fit. Women were excluded from this lifelong fat standard, shown in the differences of body ideals between adult ancient Greek men and women. But also morally, at the time, the positive characteristics associated with being overweight, chubbiness, cuteness, niceness, jolliness, lovableness, good-naturedness, were distinctly feminine. Bonafini, in her paper on body weight and beauty, states that by linking fatness to femininity, the whole concept of the feminine is negatively perceived if fatness is negatively perceived, which, as we know, will start to happen soon. With the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1790, the whole structure of society changed. With the increased availability of food and resources, famines decreased. For the first time, for the women of this era, the feminine body ideal was actually within reach for a much larger part of the population. With this mini prosperity also came a renewed interest in the female form. For centuries now, the church had banned the depiction of nude women in art, but with the Industrial Revolution, attention was given again to the ancient Greek art, birthing neoclassicism. A stark change happened in women's clothing, with corsets and massive dresses disappearing, being replaced by lighter, looser clothing that highlighted the natural female figure. Muslins were used in dresses to emulate the ancient Greek style of dress. The waistline moved from the hips to underneath the bust. The dresses were much more revealing, with a lot more skin being shown in the chest, arms, and back, almost suggesting nudity without actually showing it. The end of the 18th century was even called the Age of Undress for this reason. Of course, these new changes did have their critics, who predicted ladies would very soon be showing essentially everything. Overall, however, for a very brief time, there almost seems to be peace with the female form, with it being celebrated, adored, judged a bit less, and the ideal not being too far away from reality. That, of course, would immediately change in terrible ways. Consumption, I am aware, is a flattering malady, wrote Charlotte Bronte in 1849. She was describing her sister, who had tuberculosis. The Ladies' Magazine in 1790 established beauty as the dominant symptom of tuberculosis. According to the author, in the last stage of consumption, a lady may exhibit the roses and lilies of youth and health and be admired for her complexion the day she is to be buried. The sister Charlotte Bronte was referring to died at 29. Her other sister died of the same disease at 30. Between 1851 and 1900, tuberculosis, called consumption at the time, killed a quarter of the adult population of Europe. By the end of the century, 70 to 90% of urban populations of Europe and North America were infected with tuberculosis, and of those that developed the active disease, 80% of people died from it. It's hard to understate the absolute significance of this disease in forever changing the beauty values for women, moral values for women, and their place in society. Through an unfortunate combination of Victorian rule, status anxiety of the new middle class, and significant mortality, death became sexy, consumption became chic, and the skinny beauty ideal was born. To understand how, let's paint a picture. Firstly, Queen Victoria came to the English throne in 1859 to a neoclassical body-admiring, skin-showing population. Victoria was conservative, obsessed with her cousin/husband, and through having many children, embodied a more traditional ideal. Secondly, the Industrial Revolution created a middle class for the first time, people who were neither part of the aristocracy nor the poor lower class. Traders, merchants, people who exerted influence economically, but who nonetheless had no say in national decision-making and were not recognized fully as distinct from the lower class, which they really wanted. This was a group of people very keen to socially climb. Thirdly, in a world where disease usually meant smallpox, cholera, disfigurement, when tuberculosis spread in Europe, by comparison, it seemed much less gruesome. Doctors of the 19th century were an absolute mess, which we're going to talk about, but they had not yet discovered how tuberculosis was transmitted, cured, or avoided. So despite the fact that it was tragic and deadly, made you thin and weak and feverish, was absolutely not the beauty ideal at the time, tuberculosis, or how we'll refer to it from now on, consumption, became a tool for the mobility of the higher social classes, and so became desirable. In the lack of actual scientific knowledge about consumption, there was speculation. People observed that the rich, who of course had better living conditions, food, abilities to rest, care, had better outcomes and lived longer when infected. This led to two different views on what consumption was. The working classes were not seen as the victims of the disease, but as architects of their own demise. Their drunkenness, poor air quality, material deprivation caused the disease, which was seen as environmental, contagious, and blameworthy. Conveniently, the more prosperous classes viewed consumption and melancholia, depression, in themselves as a consequence of a hereditary defect, complicated by exciting causes. For men specifically, these exciting causes were a higher intellect, artistic ingenuity, imagination, and literary prowess. They believed consumption was both a symptom of their talents as well as a source of their achievements. As these well-off men didn't really need to engage in physical labor, apart from the minor inconvenience of their life ending, they could romanticize both their illness and the ending of life. The Victorians were obsessed with death. They found beauty in it, and as Cronenberg puts it, even dying is an act of eroticism. If you are rich, that is. Now, rich women were not considered creative geniuses for being sick. Instead, consumption symbolized the frailness and fragility associated with womanhood. It was thought that, like men, they did suffer from extreme sensibility, but unlike them, it was thought to stem from a lack of control and emotional excess. Women were thought to be incapable of hiding their emotions, which made them constitutionally transparent. As women progressed through illness, they were thought to become softer, their true character was illuminated, and they were elevated spiritually. Rich Victorian women were considered to be more prone to illness due to their feminine sensibilities, and so sickness became an integral part of female identity. I hope you see where I am going with this. As the middle and upper class of Victorian England sought to cope with their illness while distinguishing themselves from the working class, they ended up romanticizing death and illness and conservative values, leading to the new fragile, thin, pale female beauty. George Keats wrote in Sketches from Nature, "Robustness and strength do not raise in us the sense of beauty. Delicate and almost fragile things are beautiful." He then said, "Behold that fragile form of delicate transparent beauty whose light blue eyes and hectic cheeks are lit by the bale fires of decline." For Burke, feminine beauty almost always carries with it an idea of weakness and imperfection. We enter a very sinister time for beauty ideals. While in the past, both the poor and the rich valued the fuller female figure, the poor were distinguished from the rich in tangible ways. They looked different because they didn't have enough food. Now, even when women looked the same, Queen Victoria had a heavy figure her whole life. People sick of consumption, both poor and rich were thin. Moral judgments were strongly enforced to make sure they were not considered the same. While sick, poor women could be equally pale, they were described as cachectic, with dull eyes, pain necessarily producing ill temper and sometimes stupidity, while rich, sick, pale women were delicate, transparent beauties. While poorer or black women were expected to do grueling physical work, by the 19th century, physical activity in women was deemed vulgar. Well-off women were even discouraged from dancing, which was described in the Manual for Invalids in 1829, invalids including women, as very liable to do harm due to the violence of exertion. Indeed, I have frequently known that the foundation of that most fatal malady, consumption, has been very clearly traced to the returning home from the ballroom. The well-respected physician, Dr. William Osler, also explained that women wouldn't be able to exercise or run as the intensity of emotions would make her unable to pace herself and have a breakdown in the nervous system, definitely between a quarter of a mile and half a mile. Which is quite funny because I can't run and I hate running, and that would definitely happen to me, but this is not because I'm a woman. Intense, energetic and emotional, she is apt to be swept into the race at a pace far too rapid for the length of the course, and for those who drop out at the quarter mile or before the half-mile post is reached, a majority do so from the breakdown in the nervous system. I just genuinely wonder if they ever saw a woman or asked her to run, because wow. Okay, well, just a few years ago, everyone had admired the fuller female body. Now, thinness meant a more refined nature and superiority of taste. With the upper classes having separated themselves and excluded the working class from their female beauty standards, we can see in photographs of burlesque dancers who performed in the low-budget theatres for the working class, the heavier beauty ideal still strongly prevailing. This was convenient for upper classes, who now considered plumpness, which was still very common for those not sick with tuberculosis, a sign of a lack of intellect, of being tedious and slow. In 1851, the English Women's Magazine and Christian Mother's Miscellany stated, "Health, perfect and robust bodily health, is perhaps rarely found in combination with strong and fully developed intellect." People were actually being shamed for being fit. Being a bit souffrant, just suffering a little because of being sick, was preferred to having what was considered rude health. The Victorian ideals of the meek, delicate woman were fully established during this period. The ideal woman was quiet, modest, and the centre of domestic life. Men of the time asked for two things of their wives: that she should be a model of domestic virtue and that she should not do anything at all, a mark of his social status in this scramble for gaining it. In a very conservative world, the linking of your appearance to your moral value was very significant. As thin, sickly, pale women were considered more godly and desirable, fashion changed a lot. The brief period of loose dresses was gone, corsets were back, and now they were tight. If you've ever seen images of deformed ribs from corseting, they're likely from the Victorian era. Corsets were not worn so tight ever before. The invention of metal eyelets in corsets allowed for tight lacing to create a tiny waist. The corsets were not only tighter, but they were also longer, reaching far lower on your abdomen and restricting movement and breathing a lot more. They also were constructed to cause your back to stoop, making you seem even more poorly and delicate. Skirts became bigger again to make the waist seem even smaller. Sleeves started lower down on the arm, prohibiting movement above a right angle. Regular wearers of the corsets, which was many women, would have their abs completely atrophy, preventing them from regular movements and activity and keeping them dependent on the corsets for up to 14 hours a day to even stand up straight. And as you can imagine, needing space and muscles for using your lungs when having tuberculosis is kind of important, so this made the disease even worse. In 1842, an article in Fragrances magazine laid responsibility for the death of 31,090 English women from consumption at the door of unnatural and injurious practice of tight lacing. Under such literal pressure, women slowly increased the size of their skirts so they could loosen their corsets while maintaining the ratios of a smaller waist. However, these new heavy dresses became equally deadly. The massive skirts could literally cause women to be blown away and thrown into seas, lakes, or rivers, where the weight of the clothes would cause them to drown. The dresses were also a fire hazard, with journalist Petko Slavikov estimating that between 1850 to 1860, so just 10 years, nearly 40,000 women died worldwide from their dresses catching on fire. These fires were so common that Dr. Mutter, a plastic surgeon, developed the famous flap surgery to help with disfigurements of those who survived a burning. It's thought that this disastrous clothing, and therefore indirectly the judgment of beauty values on women at the time, contributed directly to the suffrage movement of the 1910s. Doctors were outraged, and maybe because they saw a lot more sick people, they hated the fashion of the time. Journalists created caricatures of the dresses. Doctors showed disdain for the back humps and shoulder blades, which women were proudly showing, even ingesting tapeworms to lose weight to obtain this consumption figure. Brinton, a doctor of the time who disagreed with female thinness, said that the only occasion in which excessive leanness has ever been beneficial to a lady was in an encounter with a cannibal. Sadly, not all doctors shared this sentiment. This research was particularly difficult for me because reading any medical paper from the 19th and early 20th century is an extreme sport of emotional regulation, but I think it is important to see just how recent, extreme, and strong medical sentiments on the inferiority of the women body are and how they might affect us today. Despite learning about sanitation and tuberculosis becoming rarer, the association between vulnerability, frailty, sickness, and femininity had terrible, lasting effects. Cesar Lombroso, no association to the salad, spent years collecting data and writing books like The Female Offender, where he takes body measurements of all sorts up to the space between fingers to establish a link between female body weight and insanity and criminality. This greater weight among prostitutes is confirmed by the notorious fact of the obesity of those who grow old in their vile trade and who gradually become positive monsters of adipose tissue. In his very hard-to-read book, he describes his disdain for fat, work, and just women in general, making me wonder what on earth happened to this man. Of course, he ends his thesis stating, in conclusion, I would remark that in prisons and asylums for the insane, the female lunatics are far more often exaggeratedly fat than the men. Doctors at the time were obsessed with female hysteria, which led to many women being sent to asylums which were described as resembling hell. Gynecologists scrambled to establish scientific explanations for their conceptualizations of women who were thought to be, in general habit, in constitution, and in general mentality, woman is halfway between man and child, and hence a certain amount of infantilism may be regarded as physiologic. Speaking of hysteria, the doctors of the time were absolutely hysterical about middle-class women entering the workforce, believing that it would cause an epidemic of insane females, degeneration of their bodies, and offspring who were mentally defective and injurious to the welfare of the nation, labeling women with public visibility as sexually suspect and most likely injurious to the health of the state, despite the fact that a lot of these women have no choice but to work, and these rich men and women were the ones forcing many women slaves to work anyways. To make it worse, there was still a hierarchy between women, with the working class, immigrants, and people of colour being thought of as even more prone to insane disorders. Researching this, I am reminded of a line by Cronenberg, the father of body horror genre. Disease is the love of two alien kinds of creatures for each other. And it feels like the Victorians, in a way, loved the bacteria of tuberculosis back. The Victorian era did a lot. It separated the rich from the poor in terms of beauty ideals. It re-established the unattainability of beauty standards in the poor. It gave people whiplash in terms of changing and judging women for being too big, too small, too short, too willowy, not pale enough, too weak, creating the evidence it needed to cement and establish the worst thoughts ever had about women's bodies and minds since time began. Thinness through illness or self-control, not exercise, was introduced as a beauty ideal for the rich white woman, and while the average BMIs are already jumping up for everyone, the landscape of the 1900s is starting to feel more familiar to the current day. It's hard for us today to imagine a time when exercising was seen as questionable, even concerning. As Natalia Melman describes, the regular, deliberate pursuit of exercise was a marginal, even suspicious activity, with those privileged enough to not work or to only do cerebral work being seen as higher class. Doctors of the time were particularly concerned with exercise for both men and women, warning against its risks and how to not do it. Since the mid-19th century, doctors believed that the heart was at risk from extreme exertion. It could become strained, leading to dilation and hypertrophy, which could result in both sudden death and long-term disability. Many medical professionals expressed extreme caution about the effect of exercise on the heart, and many manuals were written aimed at the literate upper class with medical advice relating to sport. The human frame is constructed to bear an amount of strain specified by the laws of nature, and if the amount of strain be exceeded by an appeal to violence, the entire vital system suffers in proportion to the excess. However, with more food than ever, a few people were choosing to test the boundaries of physical form and moral values. Friedrich Wilhelm Müller was obsessed with Greek statues. Born in Prussia, now part of Germany, he left his country to avoid military service and joined the circus. During his travels and training, he discovered the then much less popular weightlifting. He became one of the first known athletes to intentionally develop his muscles to predetermined proportions, aiming to look as close to the Greek statues as possible. And people were fascinated. It's truly a sign of the times to see descriptions of ladies in America's World Fair scheduling private viewings with Sando, swooning at his invitations to come feel how hard these muscles are, and reportedly being reduced to nervous trembling and even fainting when touching his rippling body. I don't know if these are quotes from him. Sander was one of the first strongmen and is considered the father of modern bodybuilding, and that people like him were part of freak shows which only a few decades ago in the 19th century were showcasing obese people to be gawked at is a sign of just how rare obesity was in the 19th century and how rare having a body which was both well-fed and well-exercised was in the 20th century. Perhaps more outrageously, considering the expectations at the time for female dress, weakness and timidity, that women would also become strong women was even more shocking. Katie Brumbach also travelled with her circus family, where her father would offer 100 francs to any man who could beat her in wrestling. No one ever won. She won the name Sanduina after lifting 300 pounds over her head, while Eugene Sandow could only lift it to his chest. She then lifted him too. Despite their clothes seeming quite revealing for the time, strong men and women, even though well known, were still very much a freak show. They were considered morally questionable and did little to question the perception of what women could generally do with their bodies. They were the exception rather than the rule. When within society, women such as Annette Kellerman in 1907 created a one-piece swimsuit to be able to swim better in competitions, she was arrested for indecency. While morals didn't change yet, what did change, however, is that sanitation improved. Tuberculosis rates went down, antibiotics were invented, more food was available, and suddenly the weight of the average person increased. Once average fat people came onto the scene, Farrell writes in her book Fat Shame, fat denigration became more common. Fat jokes proliferated in the 19th century magazines. It's interesting to see standards flipped on their head. When fatness was only realistically accessible to the rich, it was desired and the ideal. Once it became common and accessible to everyone, including the poor, being fat became unwanted and shameful. Where there's a need, there's a market. So all types of solutions for women who weren't fitting the new beauty ideal flooded the market. From rubber clothes that would dissolve your fat, to obesity soap to reduce your flesh, and bath powders to wash away all your fat, all promised to absolutely make you as slim as you wish by acting like magic, with making clear to avoid no dieting or gymnastics. Of course, doctors would also get involved, and either out of genuine unethical testing to see the effects of substances on the body, or as Upton Sinclair said, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. Doctors created concoctions of substances even they couldn't determine when needed to, promising very trustworthily that their products reduce weight to normal and restore beauty of the form in the shortest possible time, and were approved by the most competent authorities as the most rational, effective, and truly beneficial cure for obesity known to science. Oh my God. Marketing writing clearly was not invented yet. Other doctors found it to be lemon juice and water with some red food colouring. The irony of modelling ideal beauty on the illness of consumption, while warning of the health dangers of being overweight and at the same time warning against exercising, made this period in time impressively, perhaps even more confusing than today. At the same time, we end the Victorian era in a similar state to today. Too much food, weight loss scams, a yearning for thinness, and fat shaming. Then everything completely changed. World War I lasted a lot longer than any country expected. In the US, the expenses of the war and a coal crisis led to a shortage of food and money. Anti-consumerism swept America, where people were encouraged to reduce their spending and consumption, especially of food. Posters recommended people gardened instead of bought food, fished instead of used meat, pushed cheaper food replacements, and used all of their leftovers. For the first time, not the church, but the government became involved in people's weight. And the message was clear: reduce. Hoarding food or overeating was considered equal to breaking the law, and saving food was the path to winning the war. Having more fat on your body could suggest that you had eaten more than you should, a lack of patriotism or effort towards your country, and even a betrayal of it. Weight loss clubs and classes were recommended to women by Lulu Hunt Peters, who explicitly linked reducing to not just aesthetics, but moral and civic values. Watch Your Weight anti-Kaiser clubs, so anti-German clubs, were recommended to increase women's self-control and avoid indulging. Exercise, even more than before, was frowned upon as an unnecessary waste of energy and valuable food resources. It's hard for us today to appreciate just how powerful these messages and posters would have been at the time, given how desensitized we are now to advertising and public messages. At the time, these bright images and symbolism appealing to emotions in an otherwise bare environment would have been a lot more effective than today. Even in a country with less social classes, America fully spread and further pushed the new norm. Being overweight was unacceptable. The post-war 1920s brought prosperity as the economy regained its feet. This was a period of rapid but still high-friction changes in society. White women had just gotten the right to vote and entered the workforce during the war, which had changed fashion to be more suited to the need to move. Corsets were gone again. The changes didn't stop there. Dresses became shorter and shorter, revealing feet, ankles, legs, and even sometimes knees. This was so scandalous at the time that the Archbishop of Naples even went so far to announce that the recent earthquake in Amalfi was due to the anger of God against a skirt that had reached further than the knee. The new appearance of ankles almost fetishized them by today's standards, with pretty ankle contests where a policeman or a clerk would walk up and down and judge the prettiest ankles, which was a great use of resources in a time where every neighborhood essentially had their own serial killer. The full-body Miss America pageant was also held for the first time in 1921. The attention on women's bodies wasn't all warranted or tolerant, however, with Victorian modesty still driving attitudes and laws. Just 2 decades ago, Victorian beaches had required men and women to go out to sea fully dressed in outdoor clothing in carriages, which they could then change and then enter the water separately to ensure that at no point would they be seen outside in fresh air wearing their swimsuits. When women in the 1920s wore the banned abbreviated bathing suits, they were measured, and if they were deemed to be inappropriately short, women would be fined or arrested and removed from the beach. An article details how a middle-aged mother who had dared to lift her dress to wring the water out of it after swimming caught the vigilant eye of a policewoman who arrested the woman and took both her and her 2 crying children to the police station, where she was locked up until her husband could come and get her. So adamant were the police to control this new wave of inappropriate swimwear that they actually hired beach tailors who would adjust the swimsuits of girls and women to make them more modest. We can see by what they focused on most, which were the armholes and the skirt lengths, that these were the most objectionable parts on show in the 1920s beaches. It wasn't just that skirts got shorter. Hair was cut shorter and shorter, first as a bob and then shorter still to fit under the fashionable hats, being described at times as there was now nothing to distinguish a young woman from a schoolboy except perhaps her rouged lips and penciled eyebrows. Quite notably, silhouettes changed, with the waist almost disappearing, figures becoming more boyish in the classic flapper style. There's many reasons to why this massive shift happened in female beauty values, which felt like a compensation for coming out of decades of Victorian strict rule, almost a rebellion against the strict, unwanted, and deadly body clothing. Anne Boleyn suggests that during periods of liberation, like the 1920s, when women had just gotten the vote, the ideal shape for women de-emphasized their reproductive characteristics. Interestingly, thoughts about women's exercise were also slowly shifting. Articles in women's magazines started to describe how to turn your housework into exercise through things like holding a pose when putting your socks on, or stretching a bit farther down when you brush out your hair, or moving around when you vacuum your house. Then explaining what kinds of exercises women should or shouldn't do. Articles that, despite the title, explain that if it hurts when you run, it just means you should try running a bit more every day until it feels good instead of stopping. Articles described the new athletic girl type, which even dressed accordingly to the exercise rather than her usual dresses, and questioned their own feelings about exercising girls in titles such as Are Girl Athletes Masculine? Unfortunately, the public perception was that sports participation would masculinize girls' behavior, risking her feminine image. Lyndon H. Smith, a pediatrician, captured this when he wrote, "I worry about a girl becoming a great athlete, especially a runner. She might run so fast she'd never get caught by a boy." Nonetheless, the ability of women to exercise was slowly being challenged. Still, in its infancy, we can see the start of articles adding exercise to the list of things women can do to improve their shapeliness, personality, and charm. A decade of prosperity in the Roaring Twenties brought with it an increasing waistline again, and fresh concerns were being raised about those deemed unfit. At the extreme, doctors such as Norman Hare in 1922 wrote articles where he described looking forward to a time when people who were unfit, either physically or mentally, would be easily sterilized for the betterment of society. Judgments about people's bodies were passing beyond caricatures and jokes in newspapers into much more sinister waters, setting the scene for increased judgment on one's perceived fitness. The Roaring Twenties came to an abrupt halt with the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression. This was the longest and most severe depression the industrialized world has ever faced. Unemployment and poverty rose to alarming levels. Central Park in New York became Hooverville, where the newly impoverished could move into shacks. People depended on limited relief supplies to survive. The financial strain took such a psychological toll, especially on men, that they were suddenly unable to provide for their families, that the national suicide rates rose to an all-time high in 1933, increasing by 22.8% from the baseline in pre-depression in 1928. With less food available, weight fell, and disproportionately in the lower classes, who were now struggling the most with hunger and food. Even though, just a few years ago, during the First World War, a lack of food and poverty had caused a push to be smaller and eat less, the same issue with lack of food this time around led to very different outcomes. Without the moral incentive of patriotism and saving for the war, we revert back to agricultural conditions. Food accessibility is a signal of social status, and to me, shockingly, even after decades of fat shaming, in the 1930s, curvy was back in again. Scare copy was invented in 1920, where a consumer is threatened to be left a spinster, fall victim to a terrible fate, or be passed over for a lucky break unless they consume some product. And this new selling technique was used in full swing on weight gain advertising in the Great Depression. I'm genuinely getting whiplash thinking of the back and forth beauty standards, but instead of fat reducing soap, we have Skinny, the new way to add 5 to 15 pounds, quick. From the discovery to reduce any bodily part desired, we have the new discovery adds solid, healthier flesh quicker. Instead of fat is danger, we have skinny, anemic, and run-down men and women are more liable to serious infections and fatal wasting diseases, all guaranteeing the same result as weight loss products, the ideal figure, admiration, and happiness. Presumably targeted towards a population who actually had disposable income, these ads show that even among the wealthy, a heavier body was harder to come by in the 1930s, and therefore back in fashion. A novelty in beauty history, however, was the change in focus on a woman's body. The theory of the shifting erogenous zone in psychology states that once a focus of interest loses its appeal, another one has to be found. In the 1930s, the legs and ankles were abandoned in favor of the back. Dresses were bare to the waist in the back, designed almost to be seen from behind. Even everyday dresses had a slit down the back, and for the first time in history, skirts were drawn tightly around the hips to reveal the shape of the buttocks. As the Great Depression led straight into World War II, more rationing was recommended to save for the war, while women were more involved than ever in the war itself. This led to both the glorification of the virtuous American women laboring, as opposed to being completely sedentary a few years ago, with the concerns for the downfall of society, with women leaving the house seemingly temporarily forgotten. The war saw a productivity boom. Hours were increased across industries. People who were desperate and unemployed during the Depression were taken advantage of, with ungodly work hours starting to push for work reduction. This didn't really go down well. Military defeats were laid at the feet of the 40-hour work week. War heroes were paraded across the country, speaking against work time reductions, increasing the pressure for longer working hours. The war also took a bizarre turn for women, with their bodies as sexual beings being vilified and cautioned against, both as the spread of STDs increased. Interestingly, I couldn't see similar ads showcasing men as disease hosts and spreaders, but also as potential agents, sirens who would lure unsuspecting soldiers with their beauty to steal war secrets. The perception of what a clean or unclean, dangerous woman could look like highlighted almost a vilification of the sexual and a suspicion of female sensuality. Even when looking clean, the ads showcased loose women, either in revealing clothing or looking straight at you, as opposed to the virtuous, covered, truly modest and clean women. In 1945, anti-communist hysteria swept the nation, pushing for more and more work. Americans were making more than ever and saving 21% of their personal disposable income on average, as opposed to just 3% in the 1920s. With the war over and lots of money to spend, modesty was out, and the defining feature of America as we know it was born: consumerism. forget food rations and doing with less. Now the American consumer was praised as a patriotic citizen in the 1950s, contributing to the ultimate success of the American way of life. In the words of the historian Elizabeth Cohen, the good purchaser, devoted to more, newer and better, was the good citizen. It is hard to believe rations were even a thing when there now is just so much of everything to consume. In just 7 years, the weight of women increased by 6 to 8 pounds on average, twice the expected rate of increase from prior data. You know what I'm going to say now? Fat loss ads were back in. If you're fated not to be mated, putting on 10 pounds won't get you plenty of dates anymore. It's time to reduce 7 to 8 pounds a month to be beautiful. And it's not just little pills and potions whipped up by your local scam artist. No. We have full-on industries now. The back ring roller, slender massager, wooden barrel massager created life-size mouse traps to fight the battle of the bulges. Newsreel segments said,
"Girls, it seems that after you've helped to win the war, you still have another battle on your hands with your legs and things,"
showing about as much insight into women's bodies as the creator of whatever this machine is. If you didn't have a free room or two for the equipment, that's okay. You could just buy the much more convenient and absolutely not later classified as a poison for causing blindness, neuropathy and death, dinitrofanol, one of the first weight loss drugs, which was originally used as explosive munitions during the war. When factory workers who came in contact with the explosive were noticed to start losing weight, someone who probably had the same business savvy as Staten decided it would be much more profitable to sweep the explosive off the floor and switch industries. What the wooden barrel massager and the explosive have in common is an easy, effortless weight loss, a shape that is achieved through the expenditure of more money, not more energy, a way to double consume both food and weight loss solutions, almost exactly the same as today, except 2 other essential ingredients. The first, the fitness industry, would not have an easy start. From circus and a freak show to physical deformities stopping you from being able to breathe to get far enough, to being blown away, drowned or catching on fire, to ending up in prison for not wearing a cape until you get into the water, even during swimming competitions, we can safely say that intentional exercise didn't really have a great track record for women. Most unlike today, there was also no pressure to exercise. As stated in Fit Nation, the very impulse to exercise, even more so than inhabiting a body that looked like it could be improved by physical exertion, was shameful. Exercise was not just unfamiliar, many assumed, but louche. So it was most shameful when just a few years after being dragged off the beach for showing their bodies, groups and groups of men and women would actually go to Los Angeles Beach to show off their bodies, pump iron and exercise. Muscle Beach took the bodies off the circus stage and into the wild for free, and it was outrageous. Doctors like George A. Silver, chief of social medicine, pondered the mental health of some of these characters who you see sunning themselves and developing their muscles on the various beaches and gymnasiums. When George Eiferman won the Mr. America title, the newspaper piece describing it made sure to describe working out as not just a waste of time, but even a threat to one's economic prospects, and consider the economic, aesthetic and intellectual limitations of the dumbbell boys and girls on the beach. Although health magazines, which had kept up the encouragement of exercise for years now, did feature and praise the bodies of these men and women, the public didn't all feel the same, with Life readers being so repulsed by the country's most mainstream magazine featuring a vulgar display of brawn that they wrote letters to the editor recommending that this lifestyle should be banned and censored, not glamorized. Despite the backlash, a famous Muscle Beach couple managed to successfully navigate the exercise-suspicious public by carefully treading the line between old and new. Pudgy Stockton, one of the most famous Muscle Beach figures and a regular on the covers of many magazines at the time, perhaps because of her image, despite being incredibly strong, remained very feminine and more palatable for the public. She took care not to just showcase her time at the beach and lifting, but also at home, cooking and cleaning and being a respectable housewife. This balance paid off as she opened the first women's gym in 1948, which would turn into a massive franchise of establishments. Despite her clearly very well-trained body and knowing what she was doing, Pudgy was a smart businesswoman, and the ways she built and advertised her gyms highlight what the attitudes towards women's beauty were at the time. The gyms were called salons of figure development, for starters, as the word gym was too tainted. Theirs was patterned wallpaper and wood paneling and equipment that was made more to look like furniture to put women at ease by looking like a backdrop for homemaking more than heavy lifting. Presumably, this also put their husbands at ease. Pudgy's gyms were also filled with passive exercise machines to reduce cellulite, while women reduced in luxurious comfort that were considered ladylike. I genuinely would love to know what Pudgy really thought and how honest she was about how she obtained her figure, but nonetheless, she was an incredible capitalist and at least did create spaces for women to be closer to weights themselves. In a few short years, this sedentary, exercise-hating America would be transformed by a fat-shaming, exercise-respecting frenzy, and it all started with the radical undertaking of a woman who panicked the president, Bonnie Pruden. Not unlike Pudgy Stockton, she was a fitness fan who started out as a Broadway dancer, loved to hike and ski until she was made a homemaker. Her love for exercise meant that she ended up mobilizing her whole little town, creating a group to exercise the children. She was horrified to see how unfit they were, and she was not having it. Traveling to Europe to ski and seeing the difference between the fitness of children there and in America, she was determined to do something about it. With Hans Kraus, they administered a fitness exam, 6 exercises to test the back strength and flexibility in 90 seconds to 4,400 American school children and 3,000 of their peers in Switzerland and Austria. The results confirmed their suspicions and were alarming. 57.9% of American school children had failed at least one of their tests, while 8.7% of European children performed as poorly. This became known as the report that shocked the nation and was the beginning of the change in American attitudes towards physical fitness. She took the report straight to the Eisenhower White House, where, terrified of the military implications of a potential future of unfit Americans, and in the middle of the Cold War, this was taken seriously from the start. Pruden argued that economic abundance was making Americans lazy and weak, too reliant on push-button luxuries and the easy car and television-centric life of the suburbs. A generation of white middle-class children was growing up to be ill-equipped should the fight of the Cold War get too hot, their flabby bodies hardly advertising the supremacy of the American way of life, statements that are looking absolutely modern. Eisenhower considered corporally and intellectually soft Americans a national security threat. We are not a nation of softies, but we could become one. The Presidential Council on Youth Fitness was established. Their mission? To use public relations to change popular ideas about exercise and fitness to make Americans hard again. Now, this is a very important moment in history. For the first time, there is a true concern for the bodies of the population, and at this point in time, what the government does is fascinating. It takes upon itself to improve the health of the nation. Meetings with communications media, religious leaders, sports associations, educators, business leaders, journalists were had to make them focus on their work on fitness. Real estate developers were asked to clear shopping mall parking lots on Sundays for group exercise. Clerics were asked to deliver sermons on the regenerative power of exercise. Fitness teaching in school was changed. Because the army was at risk, the government cared, and the government, at this point in time, thought that the solutions should be systemic. It took responsibility and action to help people be healthier. So everything started changing. Doctors backtracked on their warning, saying that no, exercise is good for your heart. Actually, it's the luxury, not the stress or the strain, that is stopping hearts in this country. Exercise actually aids the heart. Physician and exercise booster Paul D. White insisted to a generally disbelieving public. This was a very intense campaign, and it was needed because until now, people were still suspicious of exercise and the credibility of anyone who promoted it. And the campaign definitely had its side effects. The already booming booming weight loss industry capitalized the free advertising that it was getting from the government to push more and more products that tangentially solved the problem. If you can't be fit, you can definitely get the look with maybe a weight loss couch where you burn fat through its posture rest technology. Or maybe amphetamines will help, or cigarettes, if that's a shocking thing doctors have recommended. Just a few years ago, they were advertising opium, morphine, cocaine, and heroin for kids too. By this point, we've been through various cycles of moral shaming being used to reduce people's weight, and this anti-American betrayal of the nation push is no different to that of previous wars, just with more products and more money. At least there were attempts at the time to fix the problem through structural changes. But with the consumerist economy working against them, the Presidential Council on Youth Fitness didn't really stand a chance of making a real change. Any progress would be immediately wiped out. Sadly, this anti-fatness campaign served as the perfect environment to brew some of the most sinister sentiments towards obesity. All it needed was some Sigmund Freud. In the psychosomatic concept of obesity, a doctor makes the realization that obesity is actually caused by overeating, a behavior not exclusively due to impaired metabolic function, showing that even though we take it fully for granted today that overeating is what makes you overweight, still in 1957, this was not considered widely and always the main cause of obesity. The paper then proceeds to use Freudian psychology to explain that it's actually an oral stage fixation, where the obese patient is fixated with the mother's breast to avoid facing adult life frustrations, therefore finding food as a substitute. The paper is based on many, many others, a wide-held medical review of the obese patient as someone who is mentally disturbed, the physical expression of which is the accumulation of fat, describes them literally as failures who have no success except at eating and gaining weight, unable to lose weight because loss of weight will disturb this patient, because loss of weight means a loss of special power in a form of a megalomania. It describes the wide literature on the personality type of the obese patient, condemning the books which portray them as jovial, congenial people who are happy and outgoing. Most investigators would agree that this is not the usual picture presented by the obese patient. Rather, it is the exception. And when present, it is usually a cover-up for hidden, repressed feelings of inferiority and inadequacy. There are few symptoms, somatic or psychological, that are as disturbing to interpersonal relations as obesity. It proceeds to then describe them typically manifesting great anxiety, aggressivity, giddiness, irritability, depressive and hysterical pictures, usually immature, labile, with a poorly developed emotional life, unable to accept their inner urges, excessively passive, dependent, intolerant of responsibility, and unable to express aggression. It then goes further to say that it is because of this difficulty in expressing hostility that they manage to do this via the oral incorporative introjective mechanism, a type of unconscious cannibalism. If it isn't cannibalizing their co-workers that they're eating for, it's an expression of a fantasy where overeating results in impregnation. If you're thinking, Jesus Christ, what was his evidence for all of this? None. It was literally none. Sprinkled in the text between these descriptions are sentences like, every author in the field expresses the opinion that obese patients are to some extent emotionally disturbed, but there is little agreement about the specific nature of the disturbance. Really? Really? Because I thought it was all pretty specific. Or, while it is evident that psychological factors are crucial to the development of obesity, the exact nature of the mechanism by which such psychological factors result in obesity has not yet been clearly explained. Well, the reason I mention this madness is that this was written in 1957. I have been taught in medical school by doctors that were practicing medicine then. Harold Ehrlich, who's absolutely amazing, by the way, he's like a surgeon at King's, he's great. No association to this obesity bullshit. But even as someone who actually agrees with a lot of the processed post-Freudian literature, I'm a huge fan of Bowlby, and that work was kind of built on Freud. This interpretation, this use is at once so sinister, so ridiculous, so unscientific, but at the same time, it is so telling to me, because you cannot tell me with almost 100 papers, references in this single thesis, so many doctors being named expressing such strong, horrific views on obesity and the overweight patient, that this wouldn't have an effect on their perception, judgment, or treatment of this patient that is deemed slightly overweight and above. This was not that long ago. When I wonder where the statistics for the treatment of different groups of people in medicine and outside of medicine come from, I'm reminded that the worst of the worst in science, the peak of eugenics, phrenology, whatever this obesity stuff is, was written by people who either still are treating us or at the very least influence directly the sources of what we learn. This paper sounds ridiculous, but once we see the statistics for what people think, how obese people are treated as patients or in the workplace or otherwise, it is not that far off. This paper just has more embellished language and some outright insanity, but change the language and not the message in ChatGPT, and many people would completely agree with it. That obesity is caused by mental weakness leading to overeating might have only been discovered only a few decades ago, but it was super popular from the start. It turns out that blaming people for their bodies and eating is much easier than having to make systemic changes, and it also means that you can sell them more stuff, both to eat and to lose weight. And this is what Kennedy discovered. Right before he came into office in the 1960s, files from the Soft American Project in his government office show changing sentiments about this whole body weight thing. The National Television Authority and lecturer on health, nutrition and condition, Jack LaLanne, proposed that the soft American is an individual problem and not a group problem, with the answers lying up to the individual Americans. He thought that a fit president would make Americans want to be fit. The mayor of Los Angeles, Norris Paulson, proposed 4 reasons why Americans are soft, among which are that they want something for nothing, are only interested in consumer products like TV, cars, mechanical appliances. And when Kennedy joined, he was different. Apparently, people found him fit and attractive, and he became the perfect poster boy for a fit and healthy American family, symbolizing the fitness cause a lot better than his predecessor. The PCF changed too. It began using the term physical IQ, perhaps lending some of those medical sentiments of the time about intelligence and body shape even further. To be nimble and quick was not just a physical thing, but also a mental one. The government completely misaligned its verbal and explicit message with its policies. While before people were asked not to consume and become a moral and patriotic citizen, while the government made less products available, people were encouraged to consume to be a moral and patriotic citizen, while lots of products were being pushed. Now people were being shamed for consuming too much while being pushed to endless products. It was hard to change your body shape in the past because of illness or famine or poverty. But now we had the illusion of being able to change our body in the face of the environment, and we were blamed if we couldn't. Interestingly, little reference is made in these government reports to what is happening in the country. Between 1945 and 1990, the percentage of married women participating in the labour force went from 20% to 60%, decreasing the time they had available to cook, while pre-prepared, highly processed foods became widely available. As the number of 2-person working households increased, the price of living increased to reflect it. A decent and healthy living and house was no longer a one-salary cost level, it increased. Being healthy became financial and a time luxury, increasing the numbers of people who couldn't afford it. And wanting to rest? The only other industrialized country with longer working hours was Japan, and coincidentally, it's also, at the time, the only country with a higher television watch time. Could it be that the instinct to want to spend the little leisure time available doing a low-energy activity after having to work so much might be kind of understandable, if not desirable? Also, the change in foods and the famous TV dinners, they made economic sense to buy. In 1954, just under 1 litre of milk cost on average in the US cities 22.1 cents, with TV dinners having processed meat, potatoes, vegetables costing 0.98 cents. Even though 0.98 cents in today's money is $11.18, if we use the ratios of groceries to TV dinners at the time, and today's cost of grocery with 1 litre of milk being about $1.06 in the US, that TV dinner would cost us $4.72, which is pretty reasonable. Still riding the government's free advertising, mixed messages were given in regard to eating for weight loss, from recommending people eat more sugar to a peanut butter sandwich only diet to articles that looked like they were adapted from incel forums. The 1950s and 60s were the years of the blonde bombshell, covert plastic surgery, and the slim hourglass beauty ideal. Interestingly, despite now having had cycles of weight loss and weight gain between us and the Victorians, the classist separation of beauty ideals for the rich and the poor survived them all. A great example of this is the difference between Marilyn Monroe, a very mainstream beauty, and Jane Mansfield, who was shockingly nicknamed the working man's Monroe over her ever so slightly heavier figure. A flattened image allegedly adds around 10% to someone's perceived width, growth. Because of this, slimmer models were chosen for fashion and television. However, the typical television model today is not 10% lighter than the normal female average. She's 23% lighter, which makes her slimmer than 93% of women her age. From now on, something fascinating happens. When it comes to beauty standards, one thing stands out in particular and becomes more and more important: obesity. News coverage of obesity increases, and the media frames it as a personal failure and responsibility. But people aren't just failing at their weight goals. Despite increased technological advances, living standards start to go down. In 1992, to reach the 1973 standard of living, Americans would have to work 245 hours or an extra 6 weeks a year, and yet consumption just keeps rising and rising. In this frustrating environment, audiences were ready for the boom of personal productivity books, like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, First Things First, and a productivity and fitness craze swept the 80s. Numbers of diet articles doubled and then tripled in magazines. Thinking and talking about health and fitness became mainstream. And the beauty standards? Well, despite the average height for women in America going up, the weight of Miss American winners becomes lower and lower every year. The average weight of Playboy models also keeps decreasing. Between 1978 and 1998, 77.5% of the Playboy models were more than 15% below their expected weights, and 70% were considered underweight based on their BMI. Magazines are no better, with studies investigating not just the BMI, but also the body shape of cover models, finding that between 1959 and 1999, not only were models becoming increasingly thinner, but that the exposure of their bodies to the public had increased significantly, both in occurrence and in the proportion of their bodies being shown. Attention being drawn to beauty, or the implied lack of it, was unavoidable and progressively increasing. The National Institute of Health declared obesity a disease in 1998. Now our body size was a potential sickness. Newspapers asked obesity a bigger threat than terrorism, after the US Surgeon General Richard Carmona called obesity the terror within, linking it to the events of 9/11. Everywhere, the message was clear. The skinny beauty was the ideal, and people were listening. In the US, the percentage of one's income spent on food has been on a steady decline since 1961. During 2006, 56.4% of US women reported trying to lose weight, 62.9% were on a diet, and just last year, a UK study found that 80% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that their body image had a negative impact on their health. People did not like being overweight and were trying to change it. So, did it work? Well, the World Health Organization reports reveal that in the UK, the rates of overweight or obesity went from 40% in 1975 to 64% in 2002, and that in the US, that figure was 49.1% for obesity alone and a further 30% for overweight, a 41% increase. For the record, in the late 1800s, the average BMI was under 20. So we are more health conscious and exercise conscious than ever, spending more and more on our fitness, weight loss programs, and somehow we were better off when Pudgy Stockton had us sitting on rolling massagers and local entrepreneurs were selling us food colouring love potions. So what the hell happened? I'm not going to pretend I have cracked a simple solution code to this problem, but after months of reading literally hundreds of papers on obesity, I am completely shocked by what I have and haven't been taught in medical school regarding the body. What I think is the mass gaslighting of women being told their weight doesn't matter and that being overweight doesn't affect your life, and the true effects of movements like body positivity. If you want to hear the part of the video I'm actually the most passionate about, here we go. Like the popes and the church leaders of the 6th century defined different types of gluttony, eating too soon, too much, too eagerly, we've considered eating a function of our self-control. to be able to resist and deny one's bodily urges through controlling hunger, as in the extreme cases of the Desert Fathers who kept themselves close to starvation, could be respected as a sign of control that separates us from animals, strength of character, restraint, trustworthiness, and even proximity to the godly. Despite fluctuating body standards, what has always persisted is a reverence for self-control, a judgment for the lack of it, even in times of famine and starvation. If you've ever eaten before, it will seem intuitive that the process is control-driven. We can extrapolate our own behaviors with food, both moments when we felt in and out of control with eating, onto other people's bodies, and therefore conclude what kind of behaviors must have gotten them there. Even as doctors, we are taught to do motivational interviewing with patients we observe would benefit from weight loss, implying that there is motivational or voluntary control that you can exert on your body. Let's discuss that a little, shall we? Because we need to know what exactly we might be saying when we think of body weight in this way. A natural conclusion of the self-control point of view is that today, when there is so much food available, a person who is a lower weight will, on average, have more self-control than someone who is of a much higher weight who is trying to lose weight but unable to do so. Sounds reasonable. It's also important to note that with the increasing rates of being overweight, where now the majority of people in Europe and in the US are overweight, when almost none were just a few hundred years ago, it must mean that some absolutely insane drop in the motivation and willpower of millions of people must have happened very quickly. Despite the fact that these people are also working longer hours than almost any other period in history, therefore in other ways are actually very productive. Furthermore, if we are to accept that not having the body shape you desire is an individual issue, we should see the rates of obesity fairly evenly spread in the population. However, this is not the case. In countries like the US and UK, we see that lower income groups have the highest risk and incidence of obesity and overweight, in particular in women. Not just that, but even though the prevalence of obesity and overweight is stratified by income within racial groups, between racial groups, the distribution is not equal. In the US, Black women have the highest rates of obesity of any racial and ethnic group. To further the argument that this is not an individual issue, in studies where both slimmer and more overweight participants were stressed in order to see the difference in the amount of food they would eat, there was no significant difference between participants, with the slimmer participants showing just as much self-control or lack thereof as the overweight participants. Now, inevitably, with the income group stratification comes the question of income and how this affects diet choices, which for those in poverty are affected by their accessibility of having food. Having less access to, or more difficult access to food, even in big cities, is called being in a food desert. Researchers identify 3 components that define a food desert: food access, food affordability, and food availability. In countries such as the UK, food retailers have withdrawn from city centres towards suburban and edge-of-town areas. This leaves especially low-income neighbourhoods in the city with fewer stores, but also higher relative food prices in those stores. Basket studies, which compare the prices between stores located in different areas, found that although food was slightly cheaper in the more deprived areas of London, the less affluent areas had fewer healthy foods available at all. Although to most of us, it would probably seem intuitive that healthy food does cost more. In my local shop, it costs £2.30 for a small box of grapes, or £3.20 for the actually nice ones, which I can eat in 20 minutes, versus the same cost for a whole fried chicken and chips meal near my university when I started medicine. There's a general feeling I've sensed online of people getting annoyed at the suggestion that it costs more to eat healthy. Well, you'll be happy to know that the actual people who are eating unhealthier food do not blame it on the cost. One of the largest observational studies on food costs, which studied 15,191 women in the UK, found that 71% of women in the healthiest group and 60% of women in the least healthy group, when asked, did not agree that it was more expensive to eat a healthy diet, even though this was contrary to what the evidence from the same study obtained. So, despite the difficulty, people are not playing the victim, so what is actually going on? Well, in lab conditions, people are shown to eat a constant volume of food at each meal, irrespective of the energy density of the food. So if we swap out the type of food we offer someone, they will still eat about the same amount in terms of volume. However, our foods have changed a lot in terms of calorie density, the amount of calories in the same volume of food. Not only this, but since the 1980s, the relative prices of calorie-dense foods, those which are made with added sugars and fats, have fallen a lot compared to those of less calorie-dense foods like fruit, vegetables, dairy, and meat. This is not only important because low-calorie dense foods, aka healthier foods, are more expensive to buy than before, but importantly, if you are on a budget or have less money available, you are essentially pushed towards being able to afford mainly high-calorie dense foods, which are much cheaper. If there's any part of you that still thinks people can reason their way and get smarter and more creative eating on a budget, this will hopefully be as fascinating to you as it was to me. A study in France used linear programming to model the composition of an average healthy French diet in terms of dairy, fat, sugars, etc. Then, the algorithm was given a bunch of supermarket foods, a normal budget, and asked to shop for the foods that would best fit the diet. And it managed to actually follow the shopping habits of the average French people perfectly. Great, right? So next, the algorithm was given a smaller budget and asked to shop again and again and again, optimizing for keeping the diet as close as possible to the ideal diet and having the amount of calories locked into, not increased or decreased. The budget was continuously reduced step by step, and the algorithm was run. In the end, when at the lowest budget available, the shopping cart looked very similar to the reported diets of the lowest income group. I repeat, this is an algorithm which is trying to keep a diet as healthy as possible, just working on a budget and knowing the calorie density and composition of different foods. To highlight the difference, I calculated the average UK diet and the breakdown of calories and food groups and created a basic diet for myself based on my maintenance calories, which is about 1,600 if I didn't exercise at all. And then if my diet had to change according to the algorithm, in the lowest income bracket, my new maintenance weight would go from 59 kilograms to 75 kilograms, a 16 kilogram increase. And if I just had to make a 10% reduction in my budget, my new maintenance weight on the diet would be 65 kilograms, a 6 kilogram increase. Now, of course, these were extrapolations from the study that I made on an imaginary diet for myself based on data that I found entirely online, but they do show that there is likely to be an increase in my weight, even if an algorithm is trying to optimize as much as possible for my health if I'm decreasing my budget. And these would be the changes that would happen if I'm acting like an algorithm or a perfectly rational agent. This is without any emotional eating, overeating, assuming I don't get any addictions to certain foods, have no food preferences, or that I'm depressed because my budget keeps going down and I'm not eating the food that I want to eat, which is what people actually have to do. Another study found that only in the higher levels of income are people affording to eat what they want to eat, with those at the lower income levels, despite having enough food, are not eating the types of food that they would ideally want. And this is very important. There is this theory in economics called the last dollar rule. It basically states that when the external conditions are optimally equal and allocated, this last dollar rule will be satisfied. We will receive an equal increment of utility for the last dollar spent on any item. Basically, in order to judge my decision as being free, if I only had $1 left, anything that I spend that dollar on should be equally fun for me. Otherwise, the choice isn't really free. There's no changes in spending I could make in order to make myself happier. So if I had one last pound, I could maybe buy a few carrots, not even a full pack because they cost more than £1, or I could buy 4 massive muffins. You can see how the last dollar rule isn't really fulfilled because I'd probably starve on the carrots and they taste much worse. Or, for example, if someone has had a super draining day at work, just put the kids to bed, has one last hour before they reasonably should go to sleep, would you say that they'd get the same amount of pleasure by driving to the gym or scrolling on their phone on an app which is designed to be engaging? Now, just to be clear, neither this theory or me is saying that if the resources were equally allocated, there would be no obesity. There would. If a steak and a massive slice of cake both cost $1 and they're pretty fair in terms of quality and quantity, there's always going to be people for whom the cake is going to be the better choice. The point is, they'd have much more of a choice in that case than they currently do. There's a philosophical theory called compatibilism, which basically states that we can only hold someone accountable for their actions if, in other conditions and circumstances, they would have acted in the same way. With people saying they're not eating what they want and their choices being rational even to an algorithm, and thinner and richer people eating the exact same way as them in lab conditions, I'm not comfortable saying that those who struggle with their food choices fit that condition in every case. Even more than just food, the ability to exercise is also impaired by your economic status. Many studies have found that there are significant correlations between the distance from a park and the park use itself and physical activity in general. The availability of parks, or at least safe parks, at a reasonable distance is less likely in impoverished neighborhoods. While some people are living in fitness deserts where you don't even have a park, many white-collar employees have workspace programs, health club memberships subsidized by their private insurance or by their workplace, and are much more likely to have control over their work schedules to be able to incorporate this exercise into their day. Those of lower economic status are also more likely to do shift work or work long hours with impaired sleep, which is shown to increase cortisol, which can be associated with weight gain. The fact that actually finding time to even rest enough to sleep is hard to come by lots of people just shows that we don't see that side of things, not that it doesn't exist. And things like exercise and sports not only can cost a lot of money in the case of sport, but the reality is they're not at all fun unless you do them for a while. If you're just trying to find exercise fun as an adult, starting from there, I can attest to this, it is going to be horrible unless you do it regularly, and that takes a lot of time. If you only have a few minutes, realistically, when you have the right energy and mood to do it, it's no surprise it doesn't happen. As Juliet Shore describes in The Overworked American, some people just don't have the time off it takes to enjoy things that take regular doing to become fun. By working too much, lots of people exercise too little. Now, if it sounds like I'm suggesting that every person who has less money than they'd like to eat their ideal food and works a lot must be obese, I'm not. All of these are factors that apply on the group scale with no suggestions for the individual case. So they say nothing about a certain individual on any amount of economic power, but they do seem to definitely affect society as a whole, and they may allow individuals wherever they stand to identify which factors might be affecting them. And so, where does the responsibility lie? We already saw that the economic model allows for obesity. Having people be overweight as a consequence of their rational, free choices is in line with this theory, even though we did see that we're not really in the position of making free choices, as the last dollar rule is kind of violated for the lower socioeconomic status. But however, the economy, with the increasing food density, increasing food volume, is definitely acting as though it is rational in this way. On the other hand, we also have the public health model, which states that no one should be overweight. The rational actor does and should act for maximizing health. The optimum prevalence of overweight is 0. The issue is, these theories compete with one another. Smith-Maguire argues that there is a fetish of consumer choice, where exemplary citizens are expected both to consume and to constrain themselves, yielding a destructive tension that is embodied in the neoliberal subject. This situation is probably why we saw earlier that the majority of people think it is their problem, and it's not more expensive to eat healthy. This self-blame works very well for those who are more well off, with Kate Cairns saying in the same study that the logic of health as a personal responsibility reaffirms the boundary of work of white middle-class populations, able to adopt a healthy lifestyle practice, working to distance themselves from unhealthy others, and often serving to justify their own privilege. This is a chilling echo of the situation in the Victorian era, with the aristocracy thinking they had better health outcomes with tuberculosis, not because they were more comfortable, well-fed, lived in better housing and had access to more medical care, but because they were actually a lot smarter or had a completely different disease altogether. Now we think that the rich aren't healthier and slimmer because of their healthy, expensive food, personal trainers, amazing gyms, cars, free times to go to the gym, better sleep, beds, childcare. No. It's just that the poor are ignorant, lazy, and lack self-control. And this is in complete contrast to how the poor were thought of not long ago, by the way. I read a paper from 1971 from the American Association for Health, Physical Education and Recreation, which tried to figure out why exactly were the poor better at sports, hypothesizing that it was probably a way for them to get out of poverty. But 50 years later, we just assume that they're lazier. Because of this moral association with laziness and lack of respect for yourself, we now have healthism, a term coined by Crawford to mean the individualization of health as a moral duty. But nonetheless, for women in particular, healthism needs to look different, where they need to be careful to not overdo it. Research demonstrated how women try to distance themselves from a perceived extreme of health. Even though the acquisition of expert health knowledge to control our diets is promoted, a feminine subject who is too controlling in her eating habits is pathologized as health obsessed. At the same time, if she is too relaxed with her eating habits, the paper found her to run into the risk of being perceived as ignorant, self-indulgent, and worst of all, fat. Okay. So as the impact of all of these factors and a lot more has led to an increase in undesired obesity, especially in recent years, we've moved away from the advertising and common discourse which so openly shamed fatter people. Even more than that, movements like body positivity and health at every size and further waves of feminism spread the messages that everyone is beautiful no matter how they look, that no one can and should be judged for their body, and that we should all just love ourselves the way that we are. I have a big problem with all of this, and I'm not sure I'll be able to exactly state what my problem is and where I'll stand, but I'll try. I feel we are gaslighting people when we're telling them that they should ignore their weight and that it doesn't affect their life, because that is just not true. No matter how comfortable you are in your own body, I don't think it's okay not to recognize, allow space for someone to express, empathize with, and try to do something about the reality of how heavier people who might be perfectly comfortable with how they look are treated in the world, and especially how much worse this is getting right now. Firstly, there's strong correlations between how rich you are and how slim you are, with slimmer women being much more likely to be rich, an association which is not seen in the same studies with men. Secondly, overweight individuals were found to face noticeable discrimination at work, where they are stereotyped as being less conscientious and agreeable than their known overweight counterparts. A meta-analysis of weight discrimination in employment found that overweight applicants are at a particular disadvantage when applying for jobs with considerable contact with the public, and were rated less favourably when being evaluated as a potential co-worker. Obese women in particular were found to be 16 times more likely than their obese male counterparts to face employment-based discrimination. These discriminations are measurable in real wages, with models using lagged BMI categories as measures of obesity, indicating that obese women suffer wage penalties in the neighbourhood of about 15%, even with controls being there, including marital status and child status controls. Another survey of 22,000 European women over 50 in 11 countries found that obese women earned 10% less than non-obese women, while there was no detectable difference in the hours worked between the two groups. The gold standard for finding whether weight is the real issue here is a random assignment experiment, and this was done. Pairs of identical CVs were created. The only difference between them was the weight of the person in the photograph attached. The study did find a significant difference in callbacks between the two CVs, with those who were not overweight receiving more callbacks in interviews, even though everything else was exactly the same. For the record, body weight is not a protected characteristic, and therefore this discrimination is not even illegal. And if common sense would suggest that the majority of the population in Western countries is now overweight or obese, that these issues and discrimination would lessen, nope, that does not happen. Interestingly, even the gender gap in discrimination between obese men and women is actually larger in developed countries with higher gender equality, found in studies in Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. Even beyond the gender differences, a Harvard implicit bias test, which asks people to divide items into good or bad, conducted on 4.4 million people over 13 years, found that the implicit bias against fat people actually grew in that period, with 81% of people exhibiting it by the end of the study. Every other implicit bias measured regarding race, gender, sexual orientation, age, and disability went down during that time. And the global picture becomes even more depressing, as even in countries in the world that don't follow the Western beauty ideal and have maintained consistently an admiration for higher body weight, with increasing global obesity, even those societies which have valued plumpness historically have been found to show recent preferences for a thinner beauty ideal. And these judgments don't just come from the uninformed. I felt absolutely sick reading a survey of primary care doctors, the doctors who see absolutely everyone, and found that more than half of the doctors believed that their obese patients were awkward, unattractive, and non-compliant, and a third believed that they were weak-willed, lazy, and sloppy. The paper goes on to say that given that the doctors would have to self-report these sensitive, which is one way to put it, beliefs, this is likely a massive underestimation, which doesn't make it surprising at all then to know that 70% of patients report weight stigmatization from their doctors. To say, in the face of all of this, that your life isn't different if you're overweight and you're treated the same, it's all in your head, you're just insecure, is so crazy to me, especially because I have always believed that there is so much data to show that poverty causes obesity, but I was shocked to find out that actually there is much more data to show the opposite direction of causality. Ernstberger has shown that fat fatness leads to poverty due to discrimination and downward social mobility. He stated, while there is evidence that poverty is fattening, a stronger case can be made for the converse: fatness is impoverishing. With all of these disadvantages, there is a definite power in not being overweight. When studying power in organizations, Foucault discourages us from asking who uses the power and through what formal channels to examining the ways in which power operates in everyday organizational routines, is spoken about in everyday discourses, and is reproduced and exercised by the subjects over others and themselves. By understanding how this power is used, as we saw in the workplace and in the doctor's office, we can therefore take measures, hopefully, to avoid its consequences and change things. What stands out to me in particular is how differently I felt about beauty and myself as a child, and how similar that is to the impression I get from people of the past. In the past, people were ugly, but they were expected to be because they were poor. I knew and was reminded by my mum that I wasn't a model or Hollywood actress, so I had no business or reason to be looking good, and it was fine that I didn't. But now, I and we seem to live under the delusion that we can and therefore should be able to achieve anything, and if we don't, it's both a practical and moral failing. This goes from money, success, body shape, especially with celebrities doing fake exercises while allegedly, but most likely, getting body surgeries to look the way that they do. It's in their interest for us to think that they physically worked and exercised self-control to look the way that we do, and that we can just do the same, ideally with one of their products. This is a fantasy. We even go so far as to say that not only being beautiful makes you morally superior, but being morally superior also makes you beautiful, with unproblematic people like Anne Hathaway having her personality be the reason she looks so youthful. Are you ugly? Well, maybe you should have been a nicer person. As if people don't also sometimes think that serial killers are beautiful. And on the other hand, if it's bad thoughts about you being overweight, making you problematic and therefore ugly, that's on you. There's no one else telling you that you're ugly. If you think that, it's because of your own negative thinking, and you should change it. It's not a good feminist look to have body issues right now. And for the record, I don't think anyone else's weight makes them ugly, and this whole system is disgusting. I just think that we're gaslighting people into thinking that their insecurities are in their head and not actually perceived in the world. Many things can be true at the same time. There shouldn't be anything wrong with the way that we look or wanting to change it, but there is right now. The situation is similar to cruel optimism, when the pursuit of something that is supposed to be possible is actually impossible, is always hurting, is always unattainable, and yet we always reach for it. Female beauty is made to feel this way, and the stakes are too high for many of us to give up this pursuit. On the topic of multiple things being true at once, if you've made it this far into the video and you have the free time to hear me ramble on for so long, it's probably the case that we are just luckier rather than more strong-willed, smarter, or more disciplined, better cooks, more creative, better at making choices than everyone else. It can be terrifying to open up to the idea that even though we've definitely struggled and put in the work, that actually a lot of other people have done the exact same without getting the results that we have. And what we have is just due to random chance. Because then we fall into the bottomless pit of despair that I've been in multiple times, that actually what keeps us sleeping every night is the subconscious thought that those that we pity, that we think are less disciplined than us, are actually not that different. And that maybe we don't deserve the lot that we were given. But when it comes to the data, that's what it shows. Under lab conditions, we all, even algorithms, fail in the exact same way. So what then? What helps? Well, I can tell you what doesn't. Weight stigma, fat shaming, was found to cause both children and adults to avoid exercise more, even after controlling for BMI and body dissatisfaction. It also increases the risk for unhealthy eating behaviors and poor outcomes in weight loss treatments. Weight loss treatments in particular were described by Woolley and Garner to provide patients with failure experiences, expose them to professionals who hold them in low regard, cause them to see themselves as deviant. And I want to focus on this point in particular because I've often seen and heard, even from my family members, that it's good to make someone aware of their weight, to motivate them or shame them into weight loss because it's actually good for them in the long run. This has been found to cause negative psychological well-being, which I know people know this already, but also it might be contributing to people having health problems directly related to obesity. My best friend, myself, lots of people I know of different genders have lost weight due to fat shaming. So I'm not saying that no one has lost weight because of it. I'm just saying not a single person between me and my friends at any weight has had a healthy body image and hasn't greatly struggled ever since mentally every day with food. My male friend had the fat shaming at 6 and it still affects him. So please, 1, don't do it. 2, if you must, at least be honest with yourself and call it what it is. Don't allow yourself to justify it as some type of motivation for the person. You are absolutely not helping them. You're doing it for yourself. They take enough shit for being overweight already. Weight loss campaigns and advertisements also had dubious results, with children in particular. When promoting health food, intended construct activation was found. This is basically where children get the message, but they rebel against it, having a "don't tell me what to do" kind of attitude and eating more unhealthy food than they would have eaten otherwise. They also have been found to have unintended construct activation. I'm sorry, I don't know why I found all this funny, with kids either suddenly realizing a new type of unhealthy food exists and wanting to try it, or thinking that it's so lame to be a good kid and rebelling even more. For adults, it was found that even though campaigns or studies may try to find societal problems and solutions to obesity, media coverage tends to focus on individual responsibilities and problems, and campaigns that end up not working, further encouraging us to think of it as an individual issue and not engaging enough with policy strategies. A main issue with this public health campaigns, and that's probably the part that I find a bit amusing, is the fact that generally they are just shit. They require deep and close knowledge of the target audience to be effective, which these government bodies or agencies don't seem to have. But you know who are pros at knowing their target audience? Influencers. And so we have a bigger and more effective push for individual techniques, products, and responsibility for weight loss, and terrible societal attempts when they are there. So lastly, what do? I hate myself for this, but I only have individual solutions, very ironically. And I'm sorry, I'm not smart enough for systemic solutions. That's for other people. So 1, what you eat determines more of your weight than how much you exercise. But exercise is essential for weight loss and general health. And it makes it much more likely that you actually maintain your new body shape and just enjoy life a lot more. Exercising 200 minutes or more a week was seen to be the significant amount for seeing this difference. Short bout exercise is better if you don't currently have a routine you enjoy or if you never had one. So a study found that participants who completed 40 minutes of daily activity in 10-minute segments would exercise more days a week in the long term than those who did one single 40-minute block of exercise. I personally think I would find this harder, but it apparently does work for most people, so I wanted to mention it. Another way to do this is by increasing your lifestyle activity and completely ignoring classical exercise if you have an issue with this in general. So for example, this is where you can, instead of doing a programmed 40-minute gym session, you just make changes to your daily life. This could be taking the bus stop a few stops away from your home, for example, where you're kind of forced to walk more to get home or to get the bus in the morning. This is where you treat escalators like stairs, etc. When combined with the baseline of weight loss diet, this was found to increase both the weight changes and maintenance. Actually listening to people who are overweight and what their struggles are and how we can help them make the world a better place for them and do something to change this shocking direction we seem to be going in terms of our attitudes. I feel there is an infantilization of those who struggle with their weight. We don't give fair attention to someone overweight talking about their struggles to exercise or afford or cook healthy meals, but it's fine if someone who is skinny, or even better, especially someone who has been overweight and is now skinny, talks about it. Dismissing the actual voices of people who are struggling with something until they look the way we want them to look is completely dehumanizing. And once you see this being done, it's hard to not see it. The irony of me making this video is not lost on me, but I also didn't want to go down the cringeworthy, validation-seeking path of my personal weight loss struggles and weights in order to give myself the credibility needed to say it. I just don't want to do that. So anyways, a few months ago, I wrote an essay for a public health module in medical school. And of course, I picked the title on the links between poverty and health. I'm going to end this video on what I think is a perfect summary of both our expectations for women's beauty, people's health, and life in general in the Health Gap book by Michael Mormont. I used a few quotes from this in my essay, so I wanted to mention it here. It's a more realistic adaptation of the common public health recommendations. 1, don't be poor. If you can, stop. If you can't, try not to be poor for long. 2. Don't live in a deprived area. If you do, move. 3. Don't be disabled or have a disabled child. 4. Don't work in a stressful, low-paid manual job. 5. Don't live in damp, low-quality housing or be homeless. 6. Be able to afford to pay for social activities and annual holidays. 7. Don't be a lone parent. 8. Claim all benefits to which you are entitled. 9. Be able to afford your own car. 10. Use education to improve your socioeconomic position. So yeah, I think that is the best advice that you can have for health in this economy. And I know it's like tragically funny, but just wanted to say it. In the end, I'd love to hear, especially if you made it to this part, if you also feel that beauty has never really been just about beauty. So yeah, thank you so much for spending the longest time ever with me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Be kind to yourself and others, and don't believe everything you think. Thanks.